Do you think that the US and maybe the West, quote unquote, more broadly, are going to struggle to maintain the struggle to maintain power within their own nations, like each government as it stands? Because, and I don't know what the figure is for the US, but I saw a great poll this morning where they asked I think it was YouGov had asked, in the UK, do you support Iran, Israel, or should the UK support Iran, Israel, or don't know / neither? And don't know / neither was 80%. Like, I feel like I feel like it wouldn't be a dissimilar number in America. Maybe there's a little more understanding of the US's position in the world order that would maybe push them to need to take a side. But I feel like there's a lot of pushback is coming within the individual nations, because it seems like we are driving headfirst towards World War III, but the governments don't wish to explain this great game to people. So no one understands the reason, the why, for example, it would seem that if it was any nation other than Israel doing some of the things that Israel have been doing over the past, year or two, that they would be immediately condemned, ostracized by, the wider international community, that there wouldn't be as much sort of complicit support for the things that they're doing, essentially. And I wonder if there's going to be problems within the West at maintaining enough support for their actions and their governments as they take part in this great game.
Well, I think you frame it very correctly. And this is a view that I've had for many, many years. And I think the abundance of evidence across different disciplines, different commentators, making exactly that point, makes it absolutely impossible to conclude anything but. You've given very stark examples on just one front there. And again, I understand how contentious that issue is, and I'm not here to debate the Middle East, to be abundantly clear. I'm here to talk about economic statecraft and the great game, rather than one contentious corner of it or pocket of it. But, of those two countries, it is objective fact that one of them has said we'll wipe the West off the face of the earth, including the UK and France, and the other hasn't. And yet you've just given very stark statistics that the public are like, well, we don't really know, and, let's keep out of it. There is an enormous echo right now with historical periods in the past, where one of them, pre-World War I, you had free marketeers and laissez-faire traders saying there could never be another huge war. Or they didn't use it for the term World War because there hadn't been a World War at that point, but there couldn't be one because it was a great illusion that war would ever achieve anything. Norman Angell was the one who wrote that particular book, The Great Illusion, and it argued very convincingly that there could never be a big war between the UK and Germany. And you know what? It sold all the way up until 1914, and it stopped selling, funnily enough. Now, the important thing is he actually wrote a mea culpa afterwards, which doesn't get half the attention, saying I was completely wrong, which is very rare by an academic. Yeah, absolutely. And he pointed out that one of the reasons why we got there, and one of the reasons why it would happen again, is we were trying to recreate an international system in which we had a ruling elite in every country who had more in common with each other than they did with their own countrymen. And that part of trying to create an idealized international system would create imbalances domestically as well as internationally. That if everyone agrees these are the rules of the game, fair enough. But unless you're very, very careful about how you structure it, you will end up with some countries running a huge surplus and some countries running a huge deficit. Where are we today? And you will end up with a certain decile, or even smaller than a decile, in every country living extremely well and going to school together and university together and on holiday together, and absolutely despising their fellow countryman who lives just a few miles down the road. Where are we today? Now, again, I'm not making this up. I'm just quoting, stuff written in the I can't remember if he wrote it in the 20s or the early 30s. I think it was the late 20s, but I'd have to check the publication date on that. Then, of course, in the 1930s, leading up to World War II, because everyone was quite rightly so scarred by what had happened in World War I, Nobody wanted to recognize the threat that was emerging. Nobody did. It was incredibly intellectually, morally seductive to say no more war, even as war was absolutely being thrust on us. So I'm not saying we're replicating everything, but there are certainly rhymes, or echoes from the past there. And the West, if you look at disciplines such as cryodynamics from the academic Peter Turchin, who I fully recommend everyone following, trying to look at the preponderance of statistical evidence in everyday life to show how societies are either, working efficiently or not efficiently. We are indeed seeing the kind of polarization that you're talking about. You can see it in the UK. I'm sure you're on the ground there. I'm a Brit, as you can hear from my accent. This is a deeply, deeply divided country where reform are suddenly ahead in the opinion polls who didn't even exist a few years ago because everyone is so sick of the establishment, as it were. You see the same thing in America between MAGA, the Republicans and the Democrats. You see the same thing in most European countries to a different extent. And you see similar iterations of it, I can assure you, in what we call the global South, which is desperately important to those who think globally in the West, while being completely uncovered because it's so important they don't bother covering it. They only write about their own country, which is, of course, the great hypocrisy of the way many people think. It's very hard to avoid that. All I would say is in this upcoming challenge, which is going to emerge whether we like it or not, and I don't say I like it, I'm merely describing it, you will and we will find out which countries and which societies and which economies are cohesive, which ones aren't. Now, let me just speak for 60 more seconds on this before I shut up. For example, early in the Ukraine war, we had a lot of withering commentary saying that Russia had an economy the size of Italy. And it's taken Europe a long time to realize, no, first of all, at purchasing power parity, which is what you can buy inside Russia, it's about 3 or 4 times larger than that. And secondly, it's pivoted to a war economy where everything it does is about trying to create a military machine. Europe has a vastly larger economy, which is about leisure, restaurants, going out, having a nice time, Eurovision Song Contest, etc., etc. You're not comparing apples with apples. You're not, and I'm not, I'm being serious here. You're not comparing apples with apples. You're comparing guns with butter. And how are you going to fight a war with butter? Only if the other person needs to eat it and will starve without it, and you won't give it to them. And that's off the cards for Europe because of the way Europe operates. So we will find out which economies and which societies and which polities are capable of finding a new consensus, a new structural order around this, and which ones aren't. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah, it feels very much to me like the period of globalization we had sort of post Bretton Woods up until, the last few years has been fantastic in trying to build a global supply chain, in certain industries and making specialist countries essentially in different areas of the world. And that has been, okay, maybe not fantastic for the working people of each individual nation, but has managed to grow the global economy quite significantly. But it looks like that only really works in periods of prosperity and peace. Essentially, it only works until it doesn't.
You're right. Well, not only you're absolutely right. But let me add, it has the seeds of its own destruction in it, built into it. And I've been arguing this for years. Because first of all, okay, so GDP went up. Do you remember during the Brexit vote, which years after the event, I think I can now mention, I didn't cover Brexit at the time. My gut instinct, as someone not covering it and having to be very careful because it was very, very sensitive, my gut instinct was it would go through narrowly, which the markets were not pricing for. And I remember the shock on the day when it happened, purely because my methodology was, okay, let's talk to people across the spectrum of society in the UK and abroad, expats who are voting, and let's just see what they're saying. And the people who I thought would vote for Brexit were voting for Brexit, and loads of people who I didn't think would vote for Brexit were voting for Brexit. Now, it's a very small sample size, but when I had left-wingers and pro-Europeans voting for it because they didn't like the way Europe was, I thought, this is going to be razor tight. But anyway, after that happened, someone asked someone in Sunderland, why did you vote for it, when you know it's going to be bad at GDP? And they said, whose GDP? You may remember that particular quote. So when you're looking at the global level, again, who's GDP? Most people, you could say, economists will tell you they've done, everyone's done well from it. Those are the same economists who have argued for it. They can't argue differently. Otherwise, their entire career and academic training has been for nothing. It hasn't. It hasn't been evenly distributed. And it's contained the seeds of its own destruction on two different parallel but integrated paths. One of them is that it's created massive inequality within countries and between countries in terms of who produces things and who doesn't, who is paid well, i.e. in finance, and who is paid badly, everyone else, pretty much. And they mirror each other. They are two sides of the same balance sheet, or two intersected balance sheets, one at a national level, one at an international level. But secondly, and totally overlooked by all the economists who are arguing for this year after year, the only reason it existed, as you said, because of peace and prosperity. The prosperity wasn't shared, and the peace was imposed by the US. We only had it because we won World War II by beating Nazism and Imperial Japan. Otherwise, we didn't have it. And we only had it because the West beat communism, the Soviet Union, Soviet communism. If we hadn't, we wouldn't have it. And then what did we do? We decided to dismantle all our industrial supply chains, which allow us to produce military goods, slice them up very efficiently, as you said, and put most of it in countries who we had absolutely no guarantee whatsoever would be our friends forever, and in which, in fact, many people said, don't do it from a national security perspective. And we were told, but it's cheaper. So we did, and still are doing so in the case of some countries like Germany. So to summarize, we created a system that did stupid things very intelligently. And yet, therefore, as a result, would always self-destruct at some point, as the system did pre-World War I, leading to World War I, and as the same system did pre-World War II. And I used that methodology for years to argue it. What we are seeing now, piece by piece, fight by fight, literally in some cases, as in the Middle East and as in Ukraine, Russia, is we're having to do stupid things intelligently. And that involves an entirely different skill set and an entirely different way of thinking. And yet, as they say about science, progress comes one funeral at a time. I just blew the punchline there. Mm-hmm. And you will see that in terms of policy advisors, in terms of commentators, and eventually in terms of politicians. So you name me a country, the UK is probably the best example. And we can talk about who gets that and who doesn't. But whichever country you talk about, you can have the same conversation. Who gets that and who doesn't? That's the dynamic.
Good news, everyone. My book about GameStop, the craziest story ever told, is now finished. Well, almost. Still waiting for the final draft. So, in the meantime, I think you should look at pre-ordering it or any one of the multiple fantastic, beautiful t-shirts that I have designed in order to sell with the book. Thank you, everyone, for your patience over the last few years while I have been finishing it very slowly. And I am really, really excited for people to read it. Link is in the description below. Enjoy the podcast.